Hey guys, tonight we're going to peel back the layers of time, venturing deep into the past to answer a question that's so fundamental we rarely even think to ask it. When did we stop being naked? Imagine for a moment that we are not in your room, but on the vast open savanna of East Africa 200,000 years ago. The air is thick with the scent of dry grass and distant rain. Strange giant beasts roam in the tall grasslands. Saber-toothed cats, enormous elephants, and lumbering ground sloths. Before you lies a landscape that is both beautiful and utterly terrifying. Now look down at your own skin. In this world, you are soft, you are slow, and you are completely exposed. We are a species born without armor, without thick fur, without razor-sharp claws. As the sun begins to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery orange and purple, a chill creeps into the air. You see one of your own kind, a human just like you, huddled near a small fire, their bare skin covered in goosebumps. They shiver, not just from the cold, but from a profound, gnawing vulnerability. This feeling, this deep-seated instinct to seek shelter and cover, is a direct inheritance from them to you. Over the next 100,000 years, your ancestors will push the boundaries of survival. They will endure blistering heat, torrential rains, and the creeping cold of ice ages that will swallow entire continents. They will migrate out of Africa, crossing scorching deserts and frozen tundras, competing with cave bears and giant hyenas. This entire epic journey, this conquest of the planet, will be made possible by a revolutionary and yet almost invisible technology. So when did we first decide to shield our fragile skin from the world? Was it a desperate act to fight off the cold? A clever way to avoid scratches and insect bites? Or did it begin as something else entirely? A form of art, a symbol of status, a new way to understand ourselves? And how on earth do you find the first ever shirt when it rotted away to dust 100,000 years ago? Thanks to some of the most ingenious detective work in modern science, using clues hidden in microscopic plant fibers, the DNA of parasites, and the faint scratches on ancient tools, tonight we can finally piece together the story of this invisible revolution. Frankly, without this one invention, our species would have remained a tropical footnote, and you'd most likely not exist. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. That small click sends a big signal to the algorithm. That long-form, serious educational content still matters. And to me, it's an incredibly meaningful show of support. Thank you so much for helping keep this channel going strong. It always fascinates me to see where you're all tuning in from. Let me know in the comments where you are in the world and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You can't just go looking for the world's first pair of pants. The problem, the great frustrating mystery at the heart of this entire question, is that clothing is a ghost. Think about the shirt you're wearing, or the blanket you're under. It's made of organic stuff, cotton from a plant, wool from an animal, linen from flax. The moment those materials are discarded and buried, they become a feast for a microscopic army of bacteria and fungi. In almost any environment with moisture and oxygen, your favorite hoodie would disintegrate into nothing but soil in a matter of years, if not months. This is the fundamental challenge for archaeologists. Unlike a stone hand axe or a fossilized bone, which can last for millions of years, The soft, pliable materials that made life bearable for our ancestors simply vanish. They are the missing artifacts of our history, the evidence that gets erased almost as soon as it's created. To solve a mystery with no physical evidence, you have to change your approach. You can't look for the thing itself. You have to look for the shadows it cast, the faint fingerprints it left on the world. This means we have to become forensic detectives of deep time. We must search for the rare, 1 in a billion exceptions where a piece of clothing somehow miraculously survived. We have to look for the specialized tools that suggest a skilled hand was cutting and sewing and tailoring. And most strangely of all, we have to look for clues in the bodies of other creatures whose very evolution was altered by our decision to get dressed. The story of clothing isn't found in a single neat timeline, but is pieced together from these disparate, far-flung clues. Historians still argue whether the initial push was for simple survival against the cold, or if it was driven by more complex needs, like creating baby slings to carry infants, or even for purely social and decorative reasons, much like some people used ochre as a kind of body paint long before threads were ever woven. The truth is, it was likely a mix of all these things. Our journey begins not at the beginning, but with the end product, with the oldest, most beautiful ghost of a garment ever discovered. To find our first exception, you have to travel to Egypt in the year 1913. You are with a famously meticulous, and on this particular day, famously frustrated archaeologist named Sir William Matthews Flinders Petrie. He is a legend in his field, a man so obsessed with detail that he revolutionized archaeology by insisting that everything, even broken bits of pottery, be carefully recorded. Some even called him the father of pots, for his uncanny ability to date a site based on its ceramic fragments. But right now, his attention is on a tomb at a site called Tarkhan, just south of Cairo. The tomb has been looted in antiquity, a common and soul-crushing discovery for an archaeologist. After painstakingly clearing the entrance, you find the inside has been almost completely emptied. The tomb robbers took everything of obvious value: any gold, any jewels, any fine statues. All they left behind was some scattered debris. A few calcite jars, a couple of wooden tool handles, and in the corner a large, unpromising pile of what looks like dirty laundry. For an archaeologist like Petrie, even this is worth saving. The pile of linen, along with the other minor objects, is carefully packed up and shipped back to London to be stored at University College, London. And there it sits, for decades. It's just another textile find, caked with the dust and grime of millennia. And frankly, no one has the time or resources to deal with it. It waits through the First World War, the Roaring Twenties, the Second World War, the birth of the atomic age, and the moon landing. It sits, forgotten, in a collection of ancient miscellanea. Then, in 1977, conservators are finally sorting through this old backlog from Petrie's dig. They gently begin to separate the bundle of fabric, and as the layers of grime are carefully brushed away, they realize they are holding something extraordinary. This is not a pile of rags. It's a garment. A complete one. As they unfold it, a distinct shape emerges. A dress with a graceful V-neck, long, form-fitting sleeves, and incredibly fine, delicate pleats at the bodice and cuffs. You can almost feel the texture of the fabric, a fine-spun linen that would have been a soft, creamy white when it was new. The skill involved is breathtaking. This isn't a crude sack with holes punched out for the head and arms. This is tailored, sophisticated fashion, designed to flatter the human form. For years, its true age was a mystery. Because it was found amongst other artifacts from a certain dynasty, it was dated to around 4,500 years old, which was impressive enough. But in 2015, a tiny sample of the linen was sent for the ultimate test: accelerator mass spectrometry, a hyper-precise form of radiocarbon dating. The results were stunning. The Tarkhan Dress, as it came to be known, was crafted between 3,482 and 3,102 BC. It was over 5,000 years old, making it the oldest piece of woven clothing ever discovered on Earth. The discovery immediately sparked discussion. Archaeologists still argue whether the dress was an everyday item, worn and loved by its owner until it became threadbare, or if it was a special ceremonial piece created only to be placed in the tomb for the journey to the afterlife. The signs of wear along the elbows and seams suggest it was worn in life, a personal item belonging to a slender, wealthy individual from the dawn of Egyptian civilization. But whatever its purpose, its survival is a miracle that perfectly illustrates our central problem. It didn't survive because it was special. It survived because its environment was. The tomb was a perfect time capsule, sealed away from the elements. The relentless dryness of the Egyptian desert wicked away all moisture, and the sterile darkness of the tomb gave no purchase to the bacteria and fungi that would have otherwise devoured it. Drop that same dress in a damp English field, and it would be gone in a decade. Its existence is a fluke, a 1 in a billion roll of the archaeological dice. It's a beautiful, elegant ghost that proves the rule. To find anything older, we can't hope for whole garments. We have to look for mere threads. The Tarkhan dress, as stunning as it is, was preserved by sheer dumb luck. To push the story back further, you have to leave the sterile sands of Egypt and travel north to the Anatolian plateau of modern-day Turkey. Here you find a place that looks like a gentle, unassuming hill rising from the plains. But if you were to stand here 9,000 years ago, you would be looking at one of the first large, settled human communities on the planet, a sprawling, beehive-like proto-city called Çatalhöyük. This wasn't a city of streets and avenues. It was a dense honeycomb of mud brick houses, all packed together so tightly that there were no ground-level doors. You got into your house by climbing a ladder to the roof and then descending down another ladder into your living space. It's a fascinating, almost alien layout, and for decades, archaeologists have been carefully excavating this massive mound, peeling back the layers of its 1,000-year occupation. And in the earliest, deepest layers of the city, they found something remarkable. Buried beneath the floors of the houses, as was the custom in Çatalhöyük, were the skeletons of the dead. And wrapped around some of these ancient bones were the faint, fragile remnants of fabric. These were not garments, not anymore. They were just tiny, decaying fragments, some no bigger than your fingernail, preserved only by the dry, stable conditions under the packed earth floors. When they were first discovered and analyzed back in the 1960s, the best guess was that they were made of wool. It made sense. The people of Çatalhöyük were beginning to domesticate sheep and goats. But as scientific techniques improved, the story changed. Later analyses in the 1980s and again in the 2000s, using more powerful microscopes, revealed that the fibers weren't wool at all. They came from a plant, and their structure looked remarkably like flax, the plant that gives us linen. For a long time, this was the accepted story. These people were some of the world's earliest linen makers. But the science got even better. In 2017, a new team of researchers subjected the fragments to the most intense scrutiny yet. And they discovered that while some of the textiles were indeed made from local grasses, The most well-preserved examples were not flax. They were made from the inner bark of oak trees. This is where you have to pause and appreciate the sheer ingenuity at play. They weren't just farming a convenient plant like flax, they were harvesting the trees that grew all around them. The material they used is called bast fiber, the strong, stringy tissue that a tree uses to transport nutrients. Getting it is a massive amount of work. You have to strip the bark from a sapling, then soak it in water for weeks in a process called retting, which allows bacteria to break down the gummy pectins holding the fibers together. It's a smelly, slimy process. After that, you have to repeatedly beat the sodden bark and scrape it to separate the soft inner fibers from the useless outer bark. Only then do you have a handful of rough, woody threads that you can begin to spin into yarn. It's the kind of project that makes you wonder who was bored enough to figure it out. Yet these people, 8,500 years ago, had mastered it. Archaeologists still debate whether these textiles were common burial shrouds or were reserved only for individuals of high status, a final, precious gift for the afterlife. What we know for sure is that this discovery pushes the confirmed timeline of woven textiles back by another 3,000 years, well before the elegant dress of the Egyptians. This isn't high fashion, it's fundamental technology, born from the clever, resourceful minds of the world's first city dwellers. From the bustling community of Çatalhöyük, our journey now takes a much deeper plunge into the past, leaving the Neolithic era and its early cities far behind. You have to travel west, to the rugged foothills of the Caucasus Mountains in the modern-day country of Georgia. Here, nestled in a steep, forested river valley, is a place called Dzudzuana Cave. This is not a place of organized settlement. It's a raw, elemental shelter used by small bands of hunter-gatherers during the last ice age. For tens of thousands of years, people came and went, leaving behind the scattered remnants of their lives, stone tools, animal bones, and the cold ashes of ancient fires. It's a place where you can feel the immense weight of time. And it was here, while meticulously analyzing soil samples taken from the cave floor, that researchers found something that had no right to exist. They weren't looking for it. They were probably studying ancient pollen to reconstruct the Ice Age environment. But under the powerful lens of a microscope, mixed in with the grains of dirt and sand, they saw them. Impossibly delicate, microscopic fibers. At first you might dismiss them as intrusive roots or some kind of fungal growth. But further analysis revealed they were wild flax fibers, the very same plant that gives us linen. And the layer of earth they came from was reliably dated to 30,000 years ago. This discovery alone would have been incredible, pushing back the evidence for human use of flax by over 20,000 years. But the real shock came when they looked closer, using scanning electron microscopes to zoom in on these minuscule threads. What they saw rewrote our understanding of our Paleolithic ancestors. Many of the fibers were twisted, showing a distinct S-twist pattern that doesn't occur in nature. This was the unmistakable sign of human hands at work, spinning these raw fibers into something stronger and more useful. Thread. One fiber even had a tiny, perfect knot tied in it. It was a single, frozen moment of intention from 30,000 years ago. But the most profound discovery was yet to come. The fibers had color. Examining them under different light wavelengths, the scientists found that clusters of these ancient threads had been dyed. Some were a stark black, others were a shade of gray-green or turquoise, and most remarkably of all, one single precious fiber was a vibrant shade of pink. This is evidence of a kind that sends shivers down your spine. It's one thing to imagine our ancestors making string. It's another thing entirely to imagine them choosing to dye it. The colors likely came from local plants and minerals, ground into pigments and mixed with water. The fringe idea is that the brilliant pink could have come from the root of a madder plant, or perhaps even from crushed cochineal insects, both of which were sources of powerful red and pink dyes in later antiquity. Researchers still argue whether these colorful threads were for making decorative clothing, for weaving patterned baskets, or simply for creating things like fishing nets or traps where a colored line might be useful. But the presence of color, of deliberate aesthetic choice, is a stunning leap in complexity. This find from a dusty cave floor tells us that 30,000 years ago, long before the first farm was ever planted, humans were not just surviving. They were creating. They had an eye for beauty. They were decorating their world and themselves. The story of clothing is no longer just about staying warm. It's about expression, identity, and art. The colored threads of Zudzuana Cave are an incredible, fleeting glimpse into the Ice Age world. But 30,000 years is our absolute limit for finding the fibers themselves. To go any deeper, you have to let go of the search for the garment, the textile, or even the thread. You have to start looking for the tools that did the work. When a soft organic object disappears, its ghost is sometimes left behind, impressed into the shape of the durable, inorganic tools that made it. A potter's thumbprint on a fired clay pot, a butcher's cut marks on a fossilized bone, or in our case, the fine, sharp point of a bone needle. The invention of the needle is one of those quiet, profoundly important moments in human history. It's not as dramatic as the control of fire or the invention of the spear, but it represents a massive cognitive and technological leap. It's the moment we moved from simply covering our bodies to constructing garments for them. Our search for this leap takes us all the way to a cliff face overlooking the Tongati River in KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa. Here you find Sibudu Cave, a site that has produced some of the most important evidence for the complex behaviors of early modern humans in Africa. The layers of earth in this cave are a library of the Middle Stone Age, with pages stretching back over 70,000 years. People lived here for generations, leaving behind tools, food scraps, and even the world's oldest bedding, made from compacted layers of sedges and aromatic leaves. And it was in a layer dated to approximately 61,000 years ago that archaeologists found a tiny, unassuming sliver of bone. It was broken, barely an inch long, but its shape was unmistakable. One end tapered to an incredibly fine, sharp, and perfectly symmetrical point. It was the business end of a needle. You have to appreciate the delicacy of this object. This is not a crude bone punch or an awl designed to just bludgeon a hole through a tough piece of hide. A tool like that creates a big, ragged hole that would easily tear. The point on the Sibudu needle is so thin and sharp, it would have been able to pierce a material like cured animal skin with minimal damage, parting the fibers rather than breaking them. This allows for small, strong, and closely spaced stitches. It's the kind of tool you need if you want to create a durable, weatherproof seam. This wasn't just about lacing two hides together. This was about sewing. The quirky thing is that from its size and density, experts believe the bone likely came from the leg of a small antelope, something like a duiker, carefully selected for its strength and ability to hold such a fine point. Naturally, this tiny object sparks debate. Anthropologists still argue whether such fine needles were exclusively for tailored clothing, or if they might have been used for making other complex items, like sewing together watertight bags from animal gut, or perhaps constructing the panels of a tent-like shelter. But the most compelling and logical use for such a sophisticated tool is the creation of fitted clothing. The existence of a needle implies the existence of its partner, thread, something we already know people were making 30,000 years later in Georgia. A needle and thread are a technological package, and together they unlock a new world of design. You are no longer limited to draping a single shapeless hide over your shoulders like a cape. You can now cut separate pieces, sleeves, a torso, leggings, and stitch them together into a garment that fits the contours of the human body. This is a monumental upgrade in thermal efficiency. A fitted garment traps a layer of warm air against the skin far more effectively than a loose poncho, dramatically increasing your ability to survive in the cold. The tiny needle of Sibudu Cave, 61,000 years old, is our earliest hint of the birth of the tailor. That tiny bone needle from Sibudu Cave is a marvel of precision, but it's a tool for the final act of a long and messy play. Before you can do any fine stitching, you have to get your raw material, and in a world without woven cloth, that material is the skin of an animal. Preparing an animal hide is a smelly, laborious, and frankly disgusting process. It's also the very first, most essential step in making clothing. And to do it, you don't need a delicate needle. You need a sturdy, effective, and disposable tool. You need a stone scraper. If the needle is the scalpel of the Paleolithic tailor, the scraper is the butcher's cleaver. And unlike bone needles, which are incredibly rare finds, stone scrapers are one of the most common and widespread artifacts our ancestors left behind. They are the humble, unsung workhorses of the Stone Age. Imagine the scene. A successful hunt is over, and the animal has been butchered for its meat. You are left with the raw, heavy hide. It's still warm, covered in dirt and blood, and lined with a thick layer of fat and muscle tissue. If you just let it dry as is, it would become stiff as a wooden board, completely useless, and decomposition would set in quickly. To turn this into usable leather, you first have to stretch it out, perhaps by staking it to the ground. Then, you take a piece of flint that you've carefully knapped to have a smooth, curved, but durable edge. This is your scraper. For hours you bend over the hide, your knuckles aching, and you scrape. You push the tool across the inner surface, peeling away the layers of fat, gristle, and membrane in slimy ribbons. It's an exhausting, physically demanding job that requires both strength and a bit of finesse. We know this is what these tools were for thanks to a fascinating field of science called use-wear analysis. Researchers take these ancient stone tools and examine their working edges under high-powered microscopes. A tool used to scrape wood develops a distinct kind of polish. One used to cut grasses or reeds gets a glossy sheen. And a scraper used on animal hide develops a unique combination of microscopic polish from the fat and tiny striations, and rounding on its edge from the abrasive tissue. It's a form of tool forensics, allowing us to read the ghost of the work that was done tens of thousands of years ago. To finish the job, you'd need to tan the hide, often using natural chemicals like tannins from tree bark or, in a quirky and slightly stomach-turning method known as brain tanning, using an emulsified paste made from the animal's own brain to soften the skin. This entire messy process was the absolute specialty of our closest extinct relatives, the Neanderthals. Their campsites across Europe and Asia are littered with stone scrapers, far more so than almost any other tool type. They were the undisputed masters of hide processing. This gives us our strongest piece of evidence that Neanderthals were not the brutish, shivering cavemen of cartoons. They were actively and skillfully creating the raw materials for clothing on a massive scale. But this also presents a huge puzzle. Neanderthals were great at the first step, but the evidence for the next step, the fine sewing suggested by the Sibudu needle, is almost entirely absent from their sites. This leads to the prevailing theory about their wardrobe. While we know they were working with hides, they likely wore them in simpler forms, as untailored ponchos, draped capes, or wrapped leggings, perhaps laced together with leather thongs. The great scholarly debate continues about how sophisticated their clothing truly was, but the technology for creating fitted multi-part garments seems to have been a uniquely Homo sapiens innovation. They had the leather, but perhaps not the needle. We have followed a trail of scattered breadcrumbs deep into the past. We've seen the high fashion of the Tarkhan Dress, examined the tree bark threads of Çatalhöyük, and admired the delicate bone needle of Sibudu cave. We've even felt the heft of the Neanderthal's stone scraper. But here, around 61,000 years ago, the trail of physical artifacts, the tools and the materials, goes cold. To push any deeper, we have to abandon archaeology almost entirely. We have to turn to a line of evidence that is so strange, so unexpected, and so intimate that it feels like it belongs in a different story. The oldest clue we have for when we stopped being naked doesn't come from a tomb or a cave. It comes from the body of a tiny six-legged parasite that has been our unwelcome companion for millions of years, the human louse. Now, stay with me here. I know it's not the most pleasant topic for a relaxing evening, but this is where the story takes a truly brilliant turn. As a species, we host two main varieties of this particular pest. First, there's the one you've probably heard of, the human head louse, with the scientific name Pediculus humanus capitis. It is an absolute specialist. It lives its entire life in the forest of hair on the human scalp. It feeds there, it moves through the hair shafts, and it glues its eggs, or nits, firmly to the base of individual hairs. It is uniquely adapted to that specific environment, and our ancestors have had them for a very, very long time. But then there is a second type, the human body louse, Pediculus humanus humanus. And this one is different. It feeds on the human body, but it doesn't live on our skin. It lives in the seams and folds of our clothing. This is the crucial distinction. The body louse spends its life crawling through the woven fibers of a shirt, or the waistband of a pair of pants. It lays its eggs in the fabric itself. It only ventures out onto our bare skin for a few minutes at a time to feed, before retreating back to the safety of our clothes. Genetically, these two lice are almost identical. In fact, the body louse isn't a separate species at all. It is a subspecies that evolved directly from the head louse. You can think of them as two populations of the same creature that have started to live in different neighborhoods and have adapted accordingly. And this evolutionary split could only have happened for one reason. A brand new neighborhood, a completely new ecological niche, had to open up. That niche was our clothing. For millions of years, the only habitat for a louse on a hominin was hair. But when humans started to consistently wear clothes, we essentially created a vast, artificial fleece. For the lice, this was a land of opportunity. A population of head lice, perhaps through random chance, began to colonize this new textile world. Over thousands of generations, they adapted, becoming slightly different from their scalp-dwelling cousins. This is a classic, beautiful example of evolution in action. Some researchers have a fringe idea that this transition was encouraged by another major change in our evolution, the loss of our thick coat of body hair. As the dense forest of hair on our chests and backs disappeared, the lice living there faced an existential crisis. They had to either migrate north to the scalp or find a new home. Our clothes became their refuge. Scientists still debate the exact pressures that drove the split, but one thing is certain. For the body louse to evolve and thrive as a distinct subspecies, humans had to be wearing clothes, not just occasionally, but all the time. Our garments had to be a permanent, reliable feature of our existence. The question is, can this tiny creature tell us when that happened? The fact that the body louse evolved from the head louse gives us a smoking gun. It proves that clothing became a permanent fixture of human life. But the truly amazing part is that this tiny parasite carries a clock inside its own body, a way of telling us when this revolutionary change happened. To read it, you have to look into its DNA. This is where you encounter one of the most beautiful concepts in modern biology, the molecular clock. Think of it like this. Every time a living thing reproduces, its DNA is copied. But the copying process isn't always perfect. Tiny random errors or mutations creep in. For the most part, these little typos are harmless, and they happen at a reasonably predictable average rate over long periods of time. So, if you have two populations that split from a common ancestor, like our head and body lice, both will start accumulating their own unique set of mutations. All you have to do is sequence the DNA of both, count the number of differences, and knowing the average rate of mutation, you can calculate how long they've been evolving independently. You can wind the clock backwards to the moment they parted ways. This is exactly what geneticists did. In a massive undertaking that you might call the Louse Genome Project, research teams carefully sequenced the full genomes of both the head louse and the body louse. They laid the long strings of genetic code side by side and began the painstaking work of comparison. As part of this, they paid special attention to something called mitochondrial DNA. This is a small loop of DNA found in the mitochondria, the powerhouses of the cell, and it's passed down directly from mother to offspring without being mixed with the father's genes. Because of this, it provides a very clear, unbroken line of descent, and its mutation rate is well studied, making it an excellent and reliable clock. A quirky fact of biology is that for measuring an event in this specific time frame, the last couple 100,000 years, louse DNA is actually a better clock than human DNA. Their generations are so short and they reproduce so quickly that their genetic clock ticks much faster, accumulating mutations at a rate that makes relatively recent divergences easier to spot and measure. After all the data was collected and the calculations were run, the molecular clock revealed its ancient secret. The evidence showed that the body louse split from the head louse sometime between 83,000 and 170,000 years ago. Take a moment to let that number sink in. Our previous oldest solid evidence was the Sibudu cave needle at 61,000 years. This biological evidence, carried in the body of a living parasite, pushes the timeline for consistent clothing use back by at least 20,000 years, and perhaps by more than 100,000 years. It's a staggering leap. It means that humans were wearing clothes so regularly and so universally that it permanently altered the evolutionary path of another species. Of course, like any clock, this one isn't perfect. Geneticists still debate the precise timing of the split, as molecular clocks can have margins of error depending on the mutation rates you use in your calculations. But even the most cautious, conservative estimates all agree that the split happened well over 70,000 years ago. This is a monumental conclusion. It means that the invention of clothing wasn't a recent phenomenon tied to the last ice age in Europe. It was a much older, African innovation. It places the origin of clothing firmly in the hands of the earliest Homo sapiens, long before they began their great migration that would eventually populate the entire planet. It changes clothing from a simple response to cold into a fundamental part of what it meant to be a modern human. The louse gives us a date, a fuzzy but persistent window in time between 83,000 and 170,000 years ago. This is the moment our relationship with clothing became permanent. So, let's use that outer boundary as a time machine. Let's travel back beyond it, to a world 200,000 years ago, to a time before the body louse existed. You are standing once again on that African savanna, but now you understand your place in it with a new clarity. You are a member of a species, Homo sapiens, that has already been in existence for 100,000 years. The oldest known fossils of anatomically modern humans, found at a site in Morocco called Jebel Irhoud, date back to around 300,000 years ago. This is a crucial historical fact, because it means that for at least the first half of our species' time on Earth, we were, in all likelihood, completely naked. This is the reality of the naked ape. Long before we became sapiens, our distant hominin ancestors, like Homo erectus, had already shed the thick coat of fur that covers our primate cousins. This was a critical evolutionary trade-off. By losing our fur, we became the best long-distance sweaters in the animal kingdom. We could hunt by literally running our prey to exhaustion under the hot African sun, dissipating heat with breathtaking efficiency. But this advantage came with a steep price. Our bare skin was now fully exposed to that same sun, to abrasive grasses and thorny bushes, to biting insects, and to the chill of the night air. For hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors lived with this vulnerability. Paleoanthropologists still debate what the primary driver for this hair loss was, whether it was for better cooling, to reduce the number of skin parasites, or a combination of factors. But the result was an animal uniquely sensitive to its environment. So if we were naked for so long, what changed? Why, in that window of time pinpointed by the lice, did clothing suddenly become not just an option, but a necessity? The answer likely lies not in a single event, but in a perfect storm of environmental pressure. The scientific evidence from deep-sea sediment cores and Greenland ice cores tells us that this period of the Middle Stone Age in Africa was not a time of stability. It was an era of wild, violent climate swings. The planet's pulse was erratic. In the space of just a few generations, vast areas of Africa would swing from being wet, lush, and green to being arid, cold, and desert-like, and then back again. For the small bands of humans living there, this was a recipe for constant crisis. The world was unpredictable. In a stable, warm climate, nakedness works fine. But in a world of chaotic fluctuation, you need a buffer. You need a technology that is as flexible as the environment is fickle. And that is exactly what clothing is. It's not just a winter coat. A simple animal hide can be a shield from the blistering midday sun, a blanket against a sudden nighttime cold snap, a waterproof poncho in a torrential downpour, or a barrier against wind that can sap your body heat even on a mild day. It's a multi-tool for survival, and maybe its first use wasn't even for warmth. A quirky but compelling tidbit of a theory suggests that the very first clothing might have been a simple sling made of hide or woven grasses designed to solve a fundamental problem, carrying an infant. Freeing up a mother's hands to gather food and carry tools would have been a massive evolutionary advantage. From a sling to a simple pouch for carrying nuts and roots, the concept of using materials to augment our bodies was born. The pressure of a chaotic climate likely turned this useful idea into an essential one, a second skin to protect us from a world that could no longer be trusted. So, the picture is becoming clearer. You have a biologically naked ape, whose primary advantage is the ability to cool down, living in a world of chaotic climate swings. Sometime before 83,000 years ago, this vulnerable, clever primate develops a revolutionary technology, a flexible, wearable second skin. It's a multi-tool that provides protection from sun, wind, rain, and cold. For tens of thousands of years, you and your ancestors use this new technology to survive the unpredictable moods of your African homeland. It works. It allows you to endure the droughts and the cold snaps. Your population becomes more resilient, more adaptable. But this invention didn't just allow you to survive in Africa. It gave you the key to leave it. The story of clothing is inextricably linked to the next great chapter in the human saga, the migration out of Africa. For the vast majority of our history, we were an exclusively African species. But having this new, portable environment changed the equation. A simple hide cloak or a roughly stitched tunic is more than just a garment. It is a personal shelter. It allows you to carry a small, life-sustaining bubble of warmth with you out of the tropics and into environments for which your naked body is hopelessly ill-suited. Imagine you are part of a small band, slowly, generation by generation, expanding your territory. You follow a river or a coastline, or a herd of migrating animals. As you move north into what is now the Middle East, the rules of the game change. The days might be hot, but the nights can be dangerously cold. You encounter new seasons, new weather patterns. Without clothing, a single unexpectedly cold night on the plains of the Levant could be a death sentence. With clothing, it is merely an inconvenience. The timing of the evidence is almost perfect. The major successful wave of human migration out of Africa is dated by geneticists and archaeologists to around 60,000 to 70,000 years ago. Notice how neatly this falls after the date range given to us by the lice. We invented the technology first, mastered it at home, and then used it to conquer the world. It's not a coincidence. Early, tentative forays out of Africa may have happened before, as evidenced by early Homo sapiens fossils found at sites in Israel like Skol and Kavze, which are much older. But these may have been failed experiments, populations that pushed out and then died out, unable to adapt. The great permanent expansion seems to have waited until our technological toolkit was complete. Archaeologists and geneticists still debate the exact timing and number of dispersal events out of Africa, but all agree that a major successful wave occurred around this time, and that cultural adaptations like clothing were absolutely key. The genetic evidence for this is a quirky and fascinating tidbit in itself. By studying the DNA of modern people from all around the world, scientists have found that almost every person alive today whose ancestors are from outside of Africa can trace their lineage back to a single, relatively small group of founders who made this journey. It was one group, one successful migration, that led to the peopling of Asia, Europe, Australia, and the Americas. You, listening to this right now, if your distant ancestry is European, or Asian, or Native American, are the direct descendant of one of these travelers. They were your great-great-great-grandparents, and they almost certainly made the journey wearing clothes. Clothing was our passport to the planet. It was the enabling technology that turned the tropics from a cradle into a launch pad. Without it, the story of humanity might have ended where it began. With it, every continent on Earth became our potential new home. Your passport is stamped, you've left your tropical homeland, and you are pushing into the vast, unknown territories of Eurasia. But the world you are entering is not a welcoming one. As your ancestors migrate north and west, the planet is slowly, inexorably, sliding into the grip of the last great ice age. This isn't the kind of cold you've ever experienced before. It is not the simple, temporary chill of an African night, where you can huddle by a fire until the sun rises. This is a deep, predatory and relentless cold that lasts for months on end. You are walking onto a landscape that is actively trying to kill you. Vast sheets of ice, kilometers thick, grind down from the north, locking up the world's fresh water and turning entire continents into polar deserts. The wind howls across a bleak, treeless landscape known as the Mammoth Steppe, a place that feels like a frozen combination of tundra and grassland. The very air seems to suck the warmth from your body. In this brutal new reality, the simple draped hide that served you well in Africa is now dangerously inadequate. Survival here is a game of thermal engineering, and the rules are unforgiving. Getting it wrong, even by a little bit, means you freeze to death. You quickly learn that the key to warmth is not just having a thick layer, but multiple layers. Trapping still air between 2 or 3 layers of hide and fur creates an insulating buffer that is far more effective than a single thick pelt. You also learn that any gap is a potentially fatal leak. The cold will sneak in at your wrists, your ankles, and around your neck. If you let it, you will lose precious body heat until your core temperature drops, and you slip into hypothermia. The most dangerous enemy of all, however, is moisture. If the snow melts on your clothes and soaks through, you're in trouble. Even worse, if you work too hard and your own sweat makes your inner layers damp, you have created a personal death trap. A wet garment against your skin will suck the heat out of your body 25 times faster than dry air. To survive this, you need to go from being a clothes wearer to a clothes engineer, and the archaeological record shows that this is exactly what your ancestors did. At a famous Upper Paleolithic site in Russia called Sungir, archaeologists unearthed the 24,000-year-old burials of several individuals. Their bodies were gone, their clothes had long since vanished, but they had been buried in garments that were lavishly decorated with thousands upon thousands of painstakingly carved mammoth ivory beads. And because these beads had been sewn onto the fabric, they fell in place as the clothes rotted away, leaving a perfect, ghostly outline of the garments themselves. The scientific evidence from the neat, flowing lines of beads is unmistakable. These were not simple ponchos. The Sungir people were wearing beautifully tailored, snug-fitting trousers, a pullover tunic with long sleeves, a cap or hood decorated with fox teeth, and even some kind of moccasin-like footwear. This discovery is a stunning window into the sophistication of Ice Age technology. Each tiny bead would have taken a significant amount of time to carve and polish with stone tools, meaning the complete bead-spangled outfit of the adult male at Sungir might have represented thousands of hours of labor. It wasn't just functional, it was a spectacular display of artistry and status. Paleoanthropologists still debate how rapidly this complex clothing technology developed, whether your ancestors brought the basic concepts of sewing from Africa and rapidly improved upon them, or if the unforgiving cold of Europe was the spark that ignited a sudden burst of sartorial innovation. Whatever the case, the result was a life support system. These weren't just clothes, they were personalized, wearable microclimates, engineered to protect the fragile human body from the worst that the planet could throw at it. It was this technology, above all others, that would give you the edge in a world of ice. As you and your ancestors pushed into the frozen landscapes of Ice Age Europe, you were not entering an empty world. This continent already had a human population, one that had been living and thriving there for hundreds of thousands of years. They were the Neanderthals, our closest extinct relatives. This was their homeland. They had successfully weathered previous ice ages. They knew the animals, they knew the seasons, and they knew the cold. For a long time, their survival strategies were more than enough. But your arrival, with your new toolkit of ideas and technologies, would change the game. And one of the most critical differences between your two peoples may have been hanging on your shoulders. It was a tale of two wardrobes. We've already seen the evidence for your own people's advanced tailoring. The burials at Sungir, with their beaded garments, and the fine bone needles found at other Homo sapiens sites across Eurasia, all point to a sophisticated tradition of cutting and sewing fitted clothes. Your survival kit included the tools for precision engineering. The Neanderthal toolkit, in contrast, tells a different story. As you'll remember, their sites are overflowing with stone scrapers, proving they were masters of preparing animal hides. But the delicate bone needle remains almost entirely absent from their archaeological record. This doesn't mean they went naked. That would have been impossible. Instead, it suggests they adopted a different, less complex approach to their clothing. Using the evidence we have, you can reconstruct a plausible Neanderthal outfit. Imagine a thick, heavy hide from a cave bear or a woolly rhinoceros, expertly scraped clean and softened, perhaps by chewing or using brain tanning methods. This wouldn't be cut into pieces and stitched together. Instead, it would be worn as a large, simple poncho or a heavy cape, perhaps with a hole for the head or fastened at the shoulder with a wooden pin or a leather thong. They may have had separate leggings or arm wraps, tied on with cordage. This is a simple but effective solution. A thick, windproof hide would provide a massive amount of insulation, and there's no question that this technology allowed them to survive. After all, Neanderthals had been enduring European winters for over 300,000 years before you ever showed up. Their methods worked. But in the unforgiving mathematics of Ice Age survival, working is not the same as working optimally. A simple draped cape has a critical weakness. It is terrible at preventing heat loss during activity. Stand perfectly still, and it's a warm, personal tent. But the moment you need to run, climb, or hurl a spear, the movements cause the cape to billow, creating drafts that pump the precious warm air out and suck the frigid outside air in. In contrast, your tailored trousers and close-fitting tunic move with you, keeping the insulating layer of warm air trapped against your skin. This difference in thermal efficiency has been tested in modern scientific studies, where researchers use thermal imaging cameras to watch heat escaping from people wearing replicas of these two styles of clothing. The results consistently show that while both are warm when stationary, the tailored garments are vastly superior at conserving heat during the kind of strenuous activity required for a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. The extent to which this clothing gap contributed to the Neanderthals' ultimate demise is one of the most hotly contested topics in paleoanthropology. Was it a primary factor, or just one small disadvantage among many in a world of increasing competition for resources? We may never know for sure, but in the extreme cold of a glacial maximum, small advantages can have huge consequences. A hunter who uses less energy to stay warm can travel farther and hunt longer. A child who is better protected from the cold is more likely to survive to adulthood. Your two peoples were now living side by side on the same frozen landscape, and every aspect of your technology, from your spear points to your sewing needles, was being put to the ultimate test. The image of you and a Neanderthal, both clad in your respective styles of Ice Age gear, facing off against the brutal cold, is a powerful one. It frames clothing as the ultimate survival tool, the single most important technology in the fight against the elements. And for a long time, that's exactly what it was. But was that all it was? Was the sole purpose of covering our bodies simply to avoid freezing to death? The story of clothing is much richer and more complex than that. From its very earliest origins, this technology was a multi-tool, solving a whole suite of problems that came with being a clever, tool-using, but physically vulnerable primate. Even in the warmest of climates, where you might not need a thick cloak, a few strategically placed pieces of hide could make a world of difference. Think about the simple act of moving through a dense forest or a patch of thorny scrub. Your soft, hairless skin is easily scratched, punctured, and irritated. A deep gash from a sharp branch isn't just painful, it's a potential site for a life-threatening infection. A simple pair of hide leggings or arm guards would be a form of basic armor, protecting you from the constant casual damage of the natural world. In a world full of biting flies, mosquitoes, and other insects, a light covering would offer relentless relief. But perhaps the most revolutionary function of clothing, beyond warmth or protection, was its ability to help you carry things. You are a tool-using animal, but you have a biological design flaw. You only have two hands. If you are carrying a spear in one hand and a stone axe in the other, you have no way to pick up the interesting rock you just found, or the handful of berries, or the bird's egg. This is where the invention of a simple bag, a belt, or a pouch becomes a complete game changer. By fashioning a simple leather satchel, or even just tucking a hide strip into a belt, you have effectively doubled or tripled your carrying capacity. More importantly, you have freed up your hands. This is an incredible advantage. A mother can carry her infant in a sling, keeping the baby safe and secure while leaving her own hands free to gather food or defend herself. Remember that quirky idea from before? It's one of the most compelling origin stories for clothing. Many anthropologists who study modern hunter-gatherer groups in warm climates have noted that while thermal clothing is minimal, bags, slings, and belts are absolutely essential pieces of daily equipment. While finding a 50,000-year-old leather bag is impossible, archaeologists can sometimes find indirect scientific evidence. A piece of ochre, for example, used as a crayon or for body paint, might show microscopic smoothing on all its surfaces, a kind of wear that suggests it spent years jostling around in a pouch rather than being held in a hand. It's subtle detective work. For a more concrete, if much later example, look at Ötzi the Iceman. When his 5,300-year-old body was found preserved in a glacier, he was carrying an entire mobile tool kit distributed across his clothes, a leather belt pouch containing his fire-starting kit, a quiver full of arrows on his back, and various other items tucked away. He was a walking demonstration of how clothing becomes an extension of your body, a wearable storage system. Anthropologists debate which function came first. Was the first clothing a baby sling that was later adapted for warmth, or a warm cloak that was later adapted to carry things? The truth is likely a tangled mix of all these practical needs, a series of parallel innovations that solved the fundamental problems of being a naked, two-handed ape in a challenging world. It was your first armor your first backpack, and your first tool belt, all rolled into one. You have a technology that keeps you warm, protects you from harm, and carries your tools and your children. By any measure, clothing is already a wild success. It has allowed you to survive, to migrate, to conquer new and hostile worlds. But to stop the story there is to miss the most human part of the equation. We are not just practical problem-solving apes. We are also symbolic, storytelling, meaning-making apes. And at some point in our deep past, clothing stopped being just a tool and started becoming a statement. It was transformed from a piece of survival gear into a canvas for identity. The question is, when did that happen? To find the answer, you have to look back at the clues we've already gathered. Remember those 30,000-year-old flax fibers from Dzudzuana Cave? The most important thing about them wasn't that they were spun into thread, but that they were dyed turquoise, black, and pink. Remember the 24,000-year-old burials at Sungir? The crucial detail wasn't just that the clothes were tailored, but that they were covered in thousands of gleaming ivory beads. This is the moment when function blossoms into art. Decoration is not a frivolous afterthought. It is a fundamental human universal, a way of embedding information and meaning into the world around us. And our newly clothed bodies became the first and most personal place to display that meaning. The historical evidence for this impulse is actually even older than our evidence for clothing itself. At sites in both Africa and the Levant, archaeologists have found perforated seashells, clearly used as beads, that date back over 100,000 years. This tells us that the desire to adorn ourselves, to create and wear jewelry, is an incredibly ancient part of our psychology. It was only natural that once we started wearing clothes, we would start decorating them too, transferring that symbolic language from a simple string of shells onto this new, larger canvas. A plain hide cloak keeps you warm. A hide cloak painted with ochre symbols and fringed with Arctic foxtails tells a story. Scientific analysis of the Sungir beads confirms this. Microscopic wear patterns on the beads show they weren't just made for the funeral. They had been worn for a long time, rubbing against each other and the leather they were sewn to. Furthermore, the patterns and types of adornment were different for each person. The adult male had one arrangement, while the two boys buried head to head had another, suggesting they held different roles or statuses. This is the birth of social signaling through clothing. Suddenly your garments can tell the world who you are without you ever having to speak. A necklace of wolf teeth might signal that you are a powerful hunter. A specific pattern of colored pigments might identify you as a member of a particular clan or tribe. Seashells, carried hundreds of miles inland, could speak of long journeys you had taken or trade networks you were part of. The quirky and poignant detail about the two boys at Sungir is that their outfits were just as rich and complex as the adults. This suggests their high status was inherited, not earned, a sign of a more complex social structure than we often imagine for the Ice Age. Archaeologists still debate the specific meanings of these Paleolithic symbols. We can't read their forgotten language, but the overwhelming consensus is that this decoration was a vital form of non-verbal communication. It was a way to navigate an increasingly complex social world. This is the point where your clothing becomes a second skin of meaning. It tells friend from foe, leader from follower, shaman from hunter. It is the birth of the uniform, the costume, and the fashion statement, all woven into a single, powerful technology. You are wearing your identity. Your clothes are a language, decorated with the symbols of your clan, your status, your personal history. But that language is written with materials that must be gathered from the world around you. And in Ice Age Europe, that means the animals. The vast herds of bison and reindeer, the prowling wolves and cave bears, the swift Arctic foxes. These creatures are not just your source of food. They are your walking hardware store, your living fabric depot. Each animal is a package of resources, and a key part of your ancestral knowledge is understanding which package to open for which job. You don't just see a deer, you see a potential tunic, a set of soft moccasins, and a supply of strong sinew for thread. Your choice of material is everything, and as a hunter-gatherer, you are an expert naturalist. You know that the thick, stiff hide of a woolly rhino or a steppe bison is nearly impossible to tailor into a fitted garment. Its true value lies in its toughness. You use these massive hides for creating windbreaks for your shelters, for rugged ground coverings, or perhaps for a simple, heavy-duty poncho that can turn away a hungry predator's claws. For your personal clothing, you need something more refined. The absolute best material for tailoring comes from the deer family, especially reindeer. Their hides are a perfect combination of strength, lightness, and flexibility. When properly prepared, the leather is supple and soft, allowing you to create sleeves that don't restrict your arm as you throw a spear, and trousers that don't chafe as you walk for miles on the hunt. For pure warmth, however, you turn to the predators. The dense, layered fur of a wolf or a wolverine is unmatched for insulation. You use these prized pelts to make parkas, mittens, and the ruffs around your hoods. You've learned through generations of trial and error that wolverine fur is specially magical. Its unique texture resists frost, so the moisture from your own breath doesn't freeze and build up around your face. For the softest, most delicate tasks, lining a garment for comfort, or making clothes for a newborn infant, you hunt the smaller creatures. Arctic hares and foxes, with their incredibly fine, dense fur, are perfect. Their brilliant white winter coats would have also been highly valued for decoration, a flash of pure white against the darker colors of deer and bison hide. We know this wasn't just opportunistic. At famous sites like Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic, archaeologists have found huge piles of wolf and fox bones, showing cut marks around the paws and skull that are the clear signature of skinning for pelts. This was a focused, systematic fur trade 25,000 years ago. The quirky, ingenious detail in all of this is the thread that holds it together. The best thread for sewing hides comes from the animal itself. Along the spine of a deer or a bison are long, powerful tendons called sinew. When you pound this tendon and separate its fibers, you get a thread that is stronger than any plant-based cord. And it has a hidden property. When sinew thread gets wet, it swells slightly. This means that as you stitch your garments, and those stitches are exposed to snow and rain, the thread itself expands to plug the sewing holes, creating a more water-resistant seam. Archaeologists still debate the extent to which your ancestors actively managed animal populations for these resources. Were there specialized fur trappers in the Paleolithic? Or was it a skill everyone possessed? Either way, your wardrobe was a mosaic of the local ecosystem, a testament to your deep knowledge of the animal world and your skill and courage as a hunter. Each garment was a story of the beasts you had outwitted. Your wardrobe of beasts has served you well. A mosaic of deer, wolf, and wolverine hides, expertly stitched with sinew thread, has allowed you to face down the fist of the Ice Age and survive. But to focus only on animal products is to miss half the story. Running parallel to the dramatic, bloody world of the hunt was a quieter, more patient but equally revolutionary industry: the mastery of plants. While leather and fur were the heavy-duty materials for your outer layers, the world of plant fibers provided the thread, the cordage, and the textiles that were the hidden infrastructure of your entire society. We've already seen a hint of this with those 30,000-year-old dyed flax fibers from Zudzuana Cave. That wasn't a fluke. It was a single surviving clue from what some archaeologists call the string revolution. This is the idea that the invention of string was one of the most important and transformative events in human history, as fundamental as the control of fire or the creation of the first stone axe. It sounds humble, almost laughably simple. String. So what? But you have to think about what a simple piece of cordage allows you to do. Suddenly you can bind separate objects together to create sophisticated composite tools. You can lash a sharpened flint point to a wooden shaft to create a spear that is far more deadly and effective than a simple sharpened stick. You can attach a stone axe head to a handle, multiplying its force and efficiency. The entire world of modern technology is built on this simple principle of combining materials, and that principle begins with a piece of string. Its impact on hunting was profound. With string, you can make snares and traps that hunt for you while you sleep. You can create fishing lines and hooks to exploit the rich resources of rivers and lakes. You can weave nets capable of catching an entire flock of birds or a school of fish in a single go, a return on investment that no spear hunter could ever dream of. This revolution was not unique to our species. In one of the most stunning discoveries of recent years, archaeologists examining a 50,000-year-old flint tool from a Neanderthal site in France found a tiny 3-ply cord fragment still adhering to it, preserved by a fluke of chemistry. This is the oldest direct evidence of string ever found, and it proves that even our extinct cousins had mastered this essential technology. The process of making string is a quiet one. You would have gathered plants with strong natural fibers, like wild flax, nettles, or milkweed. You'd then have to soak them in a process called retting, allowing microorganisms to rot away the fleshy parts of the plant, leaving only the tough, stringy fibers behind. These would then be twisted together, or plied, to create a cord of surprising strength. Because this technology is almost entirely organic, it is mostly invisible in the archaeological record. But we sometimes see artistic hints of its importance. Many of the famous Venus figurines, the small carved female statues of the Upper Paleolithic, are depicted wearing what appear to be woven or string-based garments. The famous Venus of Willendorf seems to have a woven cap on her head, while others are carved with detailed string skirts or waistbands. Archaeologists debate whether the string revolution was a single explosive event or a long, slow development, but all agree on its importance. While your fur parka was the armor that protected your body, the humble piece of string was the invisible thread that held your entire world together. You have gathered your materials. You have the supple, strong hides of reindeer, the warm, insulating pelts of wolves, and the fine, tough fibers of the wild flax or nettle, spun into thread. But these raw materials are just potential. They are the promise of a garment, not the garment itself. The gap between a raw animal hide and a piece of life-saving tailored clothing is vast, and it can only be bridged by one thing: an immense and ancient body of knowledge. A technology is not just the object you create, it's the complex sequence of skills, passed down from mind to mind, that allows you to create it. And the making of clothes in the Paleolithic was a masterclass in this kind of traditional, hands-on knowledge. This was almost certainly a community effort, a production line that stretched across the entire group, likely with a division of labor based on skill and tradition. The hunt, the dangerous and physically demanding work of acquiring the animal, was often, though not exclusively, the domain of men. But the equally crucial work that happened back at the camp, the transformation of that raw material, was very likely the specialty of women. Ethnographic studies of more recent Arctic hunter-gatherer societies, like the Inuit, show that the creation and constant maintenance of clothing was a central and highly respected female role. A woman's skill as a seamstress was a direct measure of her value and status. It was her expertise that kept her family alive. The autumn and winter months would be filled with the tireless, patient work of scraping, curing, softening, and sewing the hides that would see her family through the deadly cold. This work required its own specialized toolkit, far beyond just the fine needles we've discussed. You would need a variety of stone scrapers, a rough, heavy one for the initial messy work of removing flesh, and a finer, more delicate one for the final softening. You would need a sharp flint blade for cutting the hides into precise patterns. You would need bone awls, which are like thick, sturdy punches for making the initial holes in tough leather where a delicate needle might snap. The entire process was a chain of operations that archaeologists now try to reconstruct. This scientific approach, called chaîne opératoire, involves mapping out every single step, from the selection of the flint for the scraper to the final knot in the sinew thread, to understand the depth of planning and foresight involved. And the little tricks of the trade, passed from mother to daughter, were what made the difference between a good garment and a great one. You would learn, for instance, that after tanning the hide, you should smoke it for hours over a smoldering, smoky fire. This quirky tidbit of chemical engineering impregnates the leather with compounds that prevent it from going stiff and brittle after it gets wet, a common problem with simpler brain-tanned hides. You would learn exactly which part of the animal's leg bone makes the strongest needle, and how to rub it on a grooved piece of sandstone to give it a perfect point. Anthropologists debate how rigid this division of labor really was in the Paleolithic. Tasks were likely more flexible than in later societies, based on who had the skill and the time. But the existence of this deep well of knowledge is undeniable. Every stitch in your tunic was the final step in a long, unbroken thread of knowledge, stretching back thousands of years. The garment that protected you from the cold was a physical library, a record of your people's collective genius, held together by the skill of the artisan who made it. The thread of knowledge, passed down through generations, allows you to turn the skin of a beast into a garment. You put it on. And in that moment, something profound happens that has nothing to do with being warm or protected. A boundary is created. For the first time, there is a clear, physical separation between your biological body and the world outside. This artificial second skin becomes a buffer, not just against the cold, but against the gaze of others. And in the space created by that buffer, a new idea can begin to form, the concept of a private self. For an animal that lives its entire life naked among its troop, there is very little distinction between its physical body and its social presence. You are what you are, for all to see. But once you are clothed, you have a choice. You can decide what to reveal and what to conceal. This is the birth of modesty and privacy, concepts that are not biological instincts, but cultural technologies. Your body is no longer a public fact. It is a private space that you can choose to share or not. This seemingly simple change creates a cascade of new social and psychological complexities. But it goes even deeper than that. Your clothes don't just hide your body, they help to create your identity. They become an extension of yourself, a curated version of who you are that you present to your community. This is a cognitive leap of immense proportions. The decorated tunic you wear doesn't just say you belong to a certain clan. In a social context, it makes you a member of that clan. The wolf-tooth necklace doesn't just show you are a hunter. It embodies your status as a hunter. This is a concept modern science is just beginning to understand. A field called enclothed cognition studies how the clothes we wear tangibly affect our own thoughts and abilities. Studies have shown that when you put on a white coat that you believe belongs to a doctor, your brain actually becomes more focused and attentive. Put on that same coat and believe it belongs to a painter, and you become more creative. Your brain takes cues from the symbolic meaning of your clothes and alters its own performance to match. Now, imagine the power of this effect in a world where symbols are everything. When you put on a special ceremonial garment, a headdress of swan feathers, a cloak painted with the image of a bison, you are not just dressing up for a ritual. You are psychologically becoming the shaman, the spirit, the hunter. The clothes help to unlock a different part of your own mind. The ancient Romans understood this well. Our modern word person comes from the Latin persona, which originally meant an actor's mask. Your clothes are your mask, the face you choose to show the world. Psychologists and anthropologists debate whether our modern concept of a private, individual self could have even developed without the physical boundary created by clothing. Is our sense of who we are a direct consequence of this ancient invention? It's a dizzying thought. Your second skin didn't just protect your body, it helped to build your mind. It was the crucial buffer between your raw biology and the social world, and in that space, the modern human consciousness, with all its ideas of selfhood, privacy, and identity, finally had room to grow. Your clothing has become the skin of your consciousness, a canvas for your personal and social identity. But as you and your ancestors were expressing yourselves through the rich language of beads and pigments in your new European home, you were not alone. The Neanderthals were watching. And this raises a crucial question. We've established that their clothing was likely simpler in construction, warm and effective, but lacking the fine tailoring of your own. But was it also simple in meaning? Was their clothing a purely practical tool, or did they too see it as a way to express themselves? To answer this, you have to peer into the Neanderthal mind, a place that for over a century was dismissed by science as a dark, brutish, and unimaginative void. For a very long time, the standard view was that Neanderthals were the ultimate pragmatists. They were strong, they were successful survivors, but they lacked the spark of symbolic thought, the defining trait of modern humanity. Art, religion, jewelry, and complex language, these were thought to be our innovations alone. But a wave of stunning discoveries over the last few decades has completely shattered that old picture. We now have undeniable evidence that Neanderthals lived rich, symbolic lives. They consistently used mineral pigments like red ochre and black manganese, not just for practical tasks like tanning hides, but almost certainly for painting their bodies and surroundings. More compellingly, they made jewelry. At a site in Krapina, Croatia, archaeologists found a set of 8 white-tailed eagle talons, all dated to 130,000 years ago, long before modern humans were in Europe. Scientific analysis of the cut marks and polished surfaces on these talons proves they were deliberately modified, strung together, and worn, likely as a necklace or a rattle. This was not a random act. The choice of talons from a large, impressive bird of prey was undoubtedly symbolic, a statement of power, identity, or connection to the spirit world. And this is not an isolated case. Similar ornaments have been found at other Neanderthal sites. The most profound evidence for their symbolic capacity comes from Bruniquel Cave in France. Here, 176,000 years ago, a group of Neanderthals ventured deep into the blackness of the cave, hundreds of meters from the entrance, and deliberately broke off hundreds of stalagmites to construct large, circular structures on the cave floor. This monumental effort served no practical purpose. It was a planned, collaborative, and deeply symbolic or ritualistic act. So if Neanderthals were making jewelry, painting their bodies, and building strange structures in the dark, it seems almost certain that they would have decorated their clothes. Why, then, don't we find the same kind of evidence as the lavish burials at Sungir? The answer probably lies in the materials they used. Your ancestors' brilliant innovation was sewing on thousands of durable, long-lasting beads of ivory and shell, which leave a clear ghost in the soil. The Neanderthals' decorations may have been just as rich, but made of perishable materials. Imagine their hide capes painted with ochre symbols, fringed with cut leather, and adorned with the feathers of crows and eagles. All of it would have been vibrant and meaningful, and all of it would have rotted away to nothing, leaving no trace for us to find. While the evidence for Neanderthal symbolism is now undeniable, researchers still debate how widespread and complex it was, compared to the creative explosion that seems to accompany the arrival of Homo sapiens. But it's clear the gap between you and them was not a simple case of artists versus brutes. Both human species understood that what you wear is a part of who you are. Their minds were not so alien to our own, which only deepens the mystery of why one of you is here today, and the other is a ghost. You are standing on a continent of ice, a world locked in a competition between two human species, both using their ingenuity and the materials around them to survive. They are both using clothes not just for warmth, but for identity. But no matter how clever you are, no matter how skilled you are as a hunter or a seamstress, you are ultimately at the mercy of the planet itself. And after 100,000 years of grinding, frozen stasis, the planet is about to change its mind. Around 12,000 years ago, the great global thermostat begins to turn up. This is the end of the Pleistocene epoch and the beginning of the Holocene, our current geological era. It is the great thaw. You can almost hear it. The world begins to drip. The colossal ice sheets that have smothered half the continent groan and crack under their own weight. Rivers of meltwater, milky with ground-up rock, pour into the sea, causing global sea levels to rise dramatically. The very landscape is reborn. The vast, cold, dry mammoth steppe, which had stretched from Spain to Siberia, begins to shrink. In its place, moisture-loving forests of birch, pine, and oak begin to spread north, swallowing the open plains. The world grows warmer, wetter, and greener. For the humans who had perfected the art of surviving the ice, this is a change as dramatic and challenging as the coming of the cold had been for their ancestors. This new world demands a new wardrobe. The megafauna you had relied upon, the woolly mammoth, the woolly rhinoceros, cannot adapt to the changing climate and go extinct. The great herds of reindeer, your primary source of high-quality tailored leather, retreat north, following the cold they love. In the new temperate forests of Europe and the Near East, you are left with different animals and, more importantly, a profusion of new plants. This environmental shift is the trigger for the second great clothing revolution, the rise of textiles. The skills of hide preparation, while still useful, become less central. In their place, the patient, meticulous arts of harvesting plant fibers and weaving them into cloth begin to flourish. This is the moment when plants like flax, nettle, and hemp move from being a niche resource for making string to being a primary source for making fabric. But the biggest innovation is the domestication of a new kind of animal. Sheep bred specifically for their wool. The first wild sheep were hairy, not woolly, and shed their coats every year. Beginning around 6000 BC in Mesopotamia, your ancestors began a remarkable project of selective breeding, creating sheep that grew thick, soft, woolly fleeces and, crucially, did not shed them. This was an act of genetic engineering that turned an animal into a living, walking fiber factory. This required a completely new set of tools and skills. The stone scraper gives way to the spindle and the loom. You learn to card and comb the raw wool or flax fibers, aligning them so they can be spun. You learn to use a spindle, a simple stick with a weight, or whirl, on the end, to twist those fibers into a continuous, strong thread. You then construct a loom, perhaps a simple warp-weighted loom, where the vertical threads are held taut by clay weights. And you begin the methodical, rhythmic process of weaving the horizontal threads back and forth to create a piece of cloth. Archaeologists can trace this revolution through the appearance of these new tools. When they excavate a Neolithic village, the discovery of spindle whirls and loom weights is the unmistakable signature of a society that has mastered textile production. Archaeologists still debate how quickly this transition from hide to textile occurred, but it fundamentally altered our relationship with our clothing. It was no longer a trophy from a dangerous hunt, but the product of a year-long cycle of agriculture, animal husbandry, and patient craft. The world is warm, the great beasts are gone, and your wardrobe is no longer made from the spoils of the hunt, but from the fruits of the field and the flock. This shift from hide to textile, from leather to linen and wool, seems like a step towards a more settled, comfortable, and modern way of life. But this new technology came with a hidden and terrible cost, a burden that would dominate human society for the next 10,000 years. This was the tyranny of the thread. The truth is, making a hide garment is a tough job, but it's a relatively contained process. Making a woven garment, on the other hand, is a monumentally inefficient and time-consuming endeavor. The amount of human labor required to turn a handful of flax seeds or a newly shorn fleece into a finished piece of clothing is almost beyond our modern comprehension. Follow the thread of production. First, you must plant and tend your flax for a season, or spend a year carefully raising your sheep. Then comes the harvest or the shearing, a period of intense work. From there, the real labor begins. If you're making linen, you have to go through the long, smelly process of retting, then the arduous, dusty work of beating, scutching, and hackling the plant stalks to release the precious fibers. If you're making wool, you must wash the greasy fleece, then spend countless hours carding it, combing the tangled fibers into smooth, parallel strands. All of this work, and you haven't even made a single piece of thread yet. That comes next. For millennia, the only way to spin thread was with a simple hand spindle. It was a task that was constant, ubiquitous, and almost exclusively performed by women. A woman would have a spindle in her hand as she walked, as she watched children, as she sat by the fire. It was the ancient equivalent of scrolling on a smartphone, something you did in every spare moment. Only after weeks of spinning do you have enough thread to finally take it to the loom and begin the skilled process of weaving. Historians who have painstakingly recreated these ancient processes estimate that a single, simple, knee-length linen tunic, the t-shirt of the ancient world, would require somewhere between 100 and 400 hours of human labor from start to finish. Because of this colossal investment of time, cloth became one of the first true forms of abstract wealth. A finely woven, brightly dyed bolt of fabric was as valuable as a herd of cattle or a collection of metal tools. It became a primary driver of trade, a commodity that could be stored, transported, and exchanged for anything. And where you have wealth, you have the desire to display it. The quality, color, and sheer amount of fabric you wore became the most visible and potent symbol of your social standing. A wealthy landowner could afford to wear multiple layers of soft, bleached linen, while a poor farmer might have only a single coarse, undyed woolen tunic to their name. We can see this social stratification in the scientific evidence from places like the ancient salt mines of Hallstatt, Austria, where perfectly preserved textiles from the Iron Age show a clear distinction between the rough work clothes of the miners and the incredibly fine, multicolored fabrics worn by the elite. The ultimate expression of this was the dye known as Tyrian purple. This incredibly vibrant dye, made from the glandular mucus of thousands of tiny sea snails, was so astronomically expensive to produce that in the Roman Empire, its use was restricted to the emperor himself. The phrase "born to the purple" comes directly from this ultimate textile status symbol. This new reality, where your clothes broadcast your wealth, created a social pressure that would have been completely alien to your Ice Age ancestors, a tyranny of the thread that governed the lives, economies, and social structures of humanity for thousands of years. The tyranny of the thread has taken hold. Your world is now governed by the immense labor of textile production, and the cloth you wear is a direct measure of your family's wealth and effort. But for most people, this new wardrobe is a fairly drab affair. For millennia, the average person's clothing was a narrow palette of beige, cream, and brown. You wore the natural color of the fibers, the creamy off-white of processed flax, the greasy white, gray, or dark brown of undyed sheep's wool. In this world of earth tones, a flash of genuine, vibrant color would have been as shocking and powerful as a supercar driving through a peasant village. Color was a luxury. It was a statement. And the ability to create it was a form of magic, a secret knowledge that turned the dyer's workshop into an alchemist's laboratory. The dyer's art was to coax the hidden colors out of the landscape around you. It was a complex and often counterintuitive form of chemistry, learned through generations of experimentation. Reds, one of the most common and powerful colors, were often extracted from the root of the humble madder plant. The process involved drying and crushing the roots, then carefully simmering them in a pot of water to release the crimson pigment. Yellows could be produced from a variety of flowers and plants, like weld, which gave a brilliant clear yellow. The most luxurious yellow came from the tiny, thread-like stigmas of the saffron crocus, a flower so delicate that it took thousands of blossoms to produce enough dye for a single garment, making it worth its weight in silver. The most chemically complex color to create was blue. It came from the leaves of plants like woad in Europe or indigo in the warmer climates of Asia and Africa. Unlike madder, you can't just boil the leaves. The blue pigment doesn't dissolve in water. To release it, you first have to ferment the leaves in a vat of stale urine. The ammonia is a key chemical ingredient, which creates a foul-smelling greenish-yellow sludge. You would then dip your cloth into this sludge, and as you pulled it out into the open air, a chemical reaction would take place as the pigment oxidized. The cloth would magically transform from a sickly yellow-green to a deep, rich blue before your very eyes. It's no wonder that dyers were often seen as secretive, powerful figures, part artisan and part sorcerer. Most of these natural dyes also needed a helper molecule, a mordant, to act as a chemical bridge, binding the color to the fabric. Without a mordant, the dye would wash out after a few rains. Dyers discovered that certain minerals, especially alum, or the aforementioned stale urine, could make their colors permanent and even brighter. This knowledge was a closely guarded secret. We can confirm these ancient recipes today using a technique called gas chromatography mass spectrometry, which allows scientists to identify the precise chemical fingerprint of the dye molecules and mordants left in ancient textile fragments. This is how we know, for instance, about the quirky case of the Viking Age counterfeiters in Dublin. Archaeologists found a dyer's workshop there that was using cheap, locally sourced lichens to produce a passable imitation of the incredibly expensive purple dyes that were being imported from afar. It was early evidence that the moment you have high fashion, you have knockoffs. Historians still debate whether this complex knowledge was the property of exclusive guilds or if it was more common. What is certain is that the dyer was the artist who completed the garment, weaving the rainbow into the fabric of daily life and adding a final, vibrant language of meaning to what you wore. You are now a master of color. Your society has unlocked the chemical secrets of the natural world, turning the drab landscape of early textiles into a vibrant rainbow of social signals. You have this beautiful, valuable, and brilliantly colored cloth, the product of countless hours of labor from the field to the loom. Now, what do you do with it? How do you turn this flat, rectangular object into a garment? The answer to that question would depend entirely on where in the world you lived, and it would create a great divide in the history of fashion that would last for thousands of years. The logic of woven cloth is completely different from the logic of an animal hide. A hide has an irregular, organic shape. To make a fitted garment, you have no choice but to cut it into pieces and skillfully sew them back together, trying to waste as little as possible. But a piece of cloth comes off the loom as a perfect, precious rectangle. To take a pair of shears to it feels wasteful, almost sacrilegious. Every cut risks unraveling the threads and undoing all that patient work. And so, in the warm climates of the Mediterranean, a new philosophy of clothing was born. The art of the drape. Why cut your precious fabric when you can wrap, fold, pin, and belt it into a garment of stunning elegance? The ancient Greeks were masters of this. The classic Greek garment, the chiton, was little more than a single rectangular piece of linen, folded and pinned at the shoulders with ornate brooches called fibulae, and then gathered at the waist with a belt. The simplicity of the form was the point. All the style and complexity came from the way you wore it. The quality of the fabric, the number of folds, the artfulness of the draping. The Romans took this idea and turned it into an icon of power. The Roman toga was a colossal semicircle of heavy wool, sometimes 6 meters long, which could not be put on without the help of a servant. It was draped around the body according to a set of incredibly complex, unspoken rules. It was hot, cumbersome, and an absolute nightmare to keep clean. You couldn't possibly do a day's work in a toga, and that was precisely the point. It was a garment that screamed, "I am so important, I don't have to do anything." In fact, the toga was legally reserved for male Roman citizens. It was a uniform of citizenship, a privilege denied to slaves, foreigners, and disgraced exiles. While your ancestors in the south were mastering this elegant but impractical art, a very different tradition continued in the colder, wetter climates of northern Europe. The Celtic and Germanic tribes, who the Romans dismissed as barbarians, never abandoned the ancient logic of tailoring that their own ancestors had perfected during the Ice Age. For them, a draped garment was a useless folly. They needed clothes that were practical for riding horses, working in the forests, and surviving damp, cold winters. And so, they wore trousers. To the Romans, these bracha, or breeches, were the ultimate mark of a savage. But for the people of the north, they were a sensible, warm, and practical solution. We know this isn't just Roman propaganda, thanks to the astonishing evidence from the bogs. The peat bogs of northern Europe have preserved ancient human bodies with incredible detail, and their clothes are often intact. The famous Tolland man from Denmark wore a pointed skin cap and little else, but other bog bodies have been found clad in woolen trousers, tunics, and cloaks, confirming the barbarian wardrobe. In a quirky twist of history, the Romans' cultural snobbery eventually gave way to military pragmatism. Roman soldiers stationed on the frigid frontiers of Britain and Germany quickly realized that a tunic offers very little protection against a blizzard, and adopted the local barbarian fashion of wool trousers and warm cloaks. The military just hoped nobody wrote home to tell their fathers. This great divide, the draped South versus the tailored North, was the central story of clothing for centuries, a silent conversation between climate, culture, and technology. For centuries, the world of European clothing was defined by a great divide. You had the draped, flowing, and often impractical garments of the Roman South, and the tailored, practical, trouser-wearing styles of the barbarian North. These two fashion universes existed in a state of mutual suspicion, a silent conversation between two different ways of life. But no empire lasts forever. Beginning in the 4th and 5th centuries AD, the immense political and economic structure of the Western Roman Empire began to crumble. The great frontiers, which had been held for centuries, were breached. Waves of Germanic and Gothic tribes, the Franks, the Vandals, the Goths, migrated into the Roman lands, not just as raiders, but as settlers, and eventually as rulers. This was the fall of Rome, and it was not just a political event. It was a cultural collision that would fundamentally reshape the European wardrobe and create a whole new style of dress. What emerged from the ashes of Rome was a fashion fusion. The two great clothing traditions, which had eyed each other from across the Rhine and Danube rivers, now began to merge. The new barbarian elite, who were now the kings and warlords of former Roman provinces, began to adopt certain elements of Roman dress to signify their new power and to project an image of legitimacy. They might adopt the Roman tunica, but they would have it made from their own heavy northern wool and wear it over their traditional trousers. At the same time, the Roman and Romanized populations began to adopt the far more practical styles of the newcomers. The toga, already a ceremonial relic for centuries, vanished completely. In its place, trousers or brays and long-sleeved tailored tunics became the standard dress for men of all classes. The ancient Northern European love of practicality had finally won. This blend of Roman and barbarian styles gave birth to the medieval silhouette, For the next 1,000 years, the basic uniform for a man in Europe would be a layered combination of a linen undertunic, a knee-length woolen overtunic, and some form of trousers or fitted leggings, all held together with a leather belt from which he could hang his tools or a purse. For women, the look was a long linen underdress, or chemise, covered by a long T-shaped woolen overdress, often called a kirtle. The look was simple, practical, layered, and tailored. You can see it perfectly in the famous Bayeux tapestry, which chronicles the Norman invasion of England in 1066. Both the Norman invaders and the defending Anglo-Saxons are depicted wearing this exact same outfit. It had become the universal look of medieval Europe. This fusion, however, also came with a temporary loss of technology. With the collapse of the Roman trade networks, access to the luxuries of the Old World disappeared. Fine linen from Egypt, silk from the distant East, and the complex, vibrant dyes like Tyrian purple were gone. Clothing for the average person in the so-called Dark Ages became more local, more rustic, made from the wool of their own sheep and dyed with the plants that grew in their immediate surroundings. Even so, people still cared about their appearance. The Frankish Emperor Charlemagne, one of the most powerful rulers of this new era, was said to have despised the fancy silks of the Byzantine court. His official biographer wrote that he preferred to dress in the traditional, simple style of his Frankish people: a linen shirt, breeches, a tunic, and a simple blue cloak. It was a political statement, a rejection of foreign luxury in favor of his own ancestral identity. Historians still debate how much of this great fashion shift was a conscious choice, but the result was clear. The fall of Rome had created a great reset, blending two ancient traditions into a new, durable, and distinctly European style of dress. The fall of Rome created a great fashion reset, blending the tailored North and the draped South into a simple, practical, and remarkably stable European look. For the next 500 or 600 years, the basic silhouette didn't change all that much. Whether you were a peasant in the year 800 or a nobleman in the year 1100, you were likely wearing some variation of a tunic and trousers. Class and wealth were displayed through the quality of the fabric, the richness of the color, and the number of layers you wore, but the fundamental shape of your clothes remained the same. But by the 13th and 14th centuries, this long period of stability was about to be shattered by two powerful forces: a renewed connection with the outside world and a revolution in military technology. The first crack in the old order came from the Crusades. These great military expeditions reopened trade routes to the Middle East, and a river of new luxuries began to flow back into Europe. Suddenly, the wealthy elite had access to shimmering silks from Byzantium, soft cottons from Egypt, and complex woven patterns like damask, along with a whole new palette of sophisticated dyes. This influx of new materials and ideas from the more advanced textile cultures of the East sparked a desire for novelty and opulence. But the real driver of change was much closer to home, and it was made of solid steel. The evolution of armor was the single most important catalyst for a revolution in tailoring. For centuries, the main form of protection for a knight was a loose-fitting shirt of chainmail called a hauberk, worn over a simple padded tunic. But as weapons became more powerful, armorers began to add solid plates to protect vulnerable areas like the elbows, knees, and shoulders. To wear this new, rigid plate armor, the garment underneath had to be completely form-fitting. Any bunching or wrinkling in the underlying fabric would be incredibly uncomfortable and could even restrict your movement in a life-or-death situation. This military necessity presented tailors with a problem they had never had to solve before: how to make clothing that fit the human body not just loosely, but like a second skin. The solution was a series of technical breakthroughs that would define the tailor's art. They learned to cut fabric on the bias, diagonally against the weave, which gives the cloth a natural stretch. They developed complex, curved seams and gussets that could accommodate the curve of a shoulder or the bend of an elbow. And most importantly, in the 13th century Germany, some clever artisan invented the button and the buttonhole. This seemingly simple device was a complete game changer. Before buttons, your clothes had to be loose enough to pull on over your head. Buttons allowed a garment to be opened completely, pulled tight against the torso, and then fastened securely. This new, tight-fitting silhouette, born on the battlefield, quickly became the height of civilian fashion. A wealthy nobleman would show off his athletic physique in a tight, padded tunic called a doublet, worn over hose so tight they were essentially leggings. It was a look that was youthful, masculine, and, most importantly, incredibly expensive, as it required the skills of a master tailor. This dramatic change is clearly visible in the art of the period, as the loose, T-shaped figures of the Romanesque era give way to the sculpted, form-fitting people of the Gothic age. Fashion became so flamboyant that men would often wear party-colored hose, with one leg dyed bright red and the other bright blue, a peacock-like display of wealth and allegiance. Fashion historians still debate the primary driver for this revolution. Was it military need or social ambition? But the result was the death of the old, stable silhouette. The tailor was now an artist, and fashion, as a system of rapid and competitive change, had truly been born. The tailor has been unleashed. Driven by the demands of a new kind of warfare, he has mastered the art of sculpting fabric to the human form. For men, this resulted in a tight-fitting athletic silhouette that broadcasted youth and power. But what was happening on the other side of the royal court? As men's fashion became more angular and revealing of the body's natural shape, women's fashion began to move in a parallel but distinct direction. It too became a science of construction, but instead of just fitting the body, it began to actively reshape it into a new, idealized, and almost architectural form. For centuries, the standard European woman's garment had been the kirtle, a simple T-shaped woolen dress. But by the 14th and 15th centuries, this gave way to the more complex gown. Using the same new tailoring techniques, the upper part of the gown, the bodice, was now cut to be incredibly tight. The garment would be put on and then laced up the back or side, pulling the fabric taut against the torso to create a smooth, stiff upper body and a high, defined waist. To accentuate the smallness of this tight bodice, the other parts of the garment exploded in volume. Skirts became immensely full, using triangular inserts of fabric called gauze to create a vast, flowing expanse of cloth that could pool on the floor. Sleeves, too, became long, decorative, and elaborate. The entire look was a study in contrasts, a tight, restrictive torso flaring out into a cascade of luxurious fabric. By the 15th century, this evolved into a very specific and, to our modern eyes, unusual silhouette. The fashionable ideal was a high waistline that sat just below the bust, a rounded belly that was often deliberately padded to create a perpetually pregnant look, and a long, sweeping skirt. This was an aesthetic that celebrated fertility, and of course, the immense wealth required to afford that much fabric. This new, competitive world of fashion was so alarming to the old aristocracy that they tried to regulate it. They passed what were known as sumptuary laws, detailed rules that dictated who was allowed to wear what. A merchant's wife might be legally forbidden from wearing the ermine fur or silk velvet reserved for a duchess. These laws were almost universally ignored, proving that telling people what not to wear is a losing battle. But they show how high the stakes of fashion had become. The physical cost of this new silhouette could be high. Skeletal remains of elite medieval women sometimes show deformations in the lower ribs, the result of a lifetime spent in tightly laced bodices that literally reshaped their bodies. The look was often topped off with the hennin, the fantastically impractical, tall, conical hat you often see in fairy tale depictions of princesses. These hats could be over 2 feet high, draped with a fine veil, and were a pure, unambiguous symbol of status. You simply couldn't perform any manual labor while balancing one on your head. Historians still debate the meaning of these new, restrictive fashions. Were they a tool of patriarchal control, a way for a powerful man to display his wealth by encasing his wife in a beautiful but impractical costume? Or were they also a sphere of female power and competition, a language that women themselves used to navigate the complex hierarchies of the court? The truth is likely a mixture of both. What is certain is that clothing had crossed a crucial threshold. It was no longer just a covering for the body. It was now an instrument used to defy the body's natural shape, to sculpt it into a living work of art that reflected the abstract ideals of the age. The tailor's art has transformed your body into a work of architecture, sculpting your natural form into an idealized shape with clever cuts and tight lacing. But as the Middle Ages give way to the Renaissance and the early modern era of the 16th century, this architecture becomes something more rigid, more extreme. It becomes engineering. The goal is no longer simply to shape the body, but to completely reconstruct it, to encase it in an artificial, geometric scaffold that defies nature itself. This is the era of the caged body, and its 2 key instruments of transformation were the corset and the farthingale. The corset, or stays, as it was often called, evolved from the stiffened bodices of the late medieval period. But it was a far more formidable piece of equipment. Imagine a garment made of multiple layers of thick, stiff linen, often glued together. Into this were inserted rigid supports made of whalebone, the flexible baleen from a whale's mouth, or even slats of wood or horn. This rigid cage would then be put on and laced as tightly as possible, cinching the waist to an unnatural smallness, flattening the stomach and forcing the torso into a perfectly smooth, inverted cone shape. The fashionable ideal was a completely flat, V-shaped torso with no hint of the body's natural curves. It was uncomfortable, restrictive, and a clear sign that the wearer did not need to bend or breathe too deeply. While the corset was caging the upper body, an even stranger structure was expanding the lower body. This was the farthingale. The first version, the Spanish farthingale, popular at the Tudor court in England, was a petticoat with a series of circular hoops made of rope, wire, or willow sewn into it. The hoops grew progressively larger towards the floor, creating a stiff bell or cone-shaped skirt. But by the late 16th century, this evolved into the even more extreme French or wheel farthingale. This was a huge, rigid wheel-like structure that was worn around the waist, creating a flat, tabletop-like platform from which the skirt dropped vertically to the floor. It was like wearing a small table around your hips. The combination of these 2 technologies created a silhouette that was completely alien and artificial. A woman's body would appear as a tiny, rigid, V-shaped torso emerging from the center of a vast circular platform. The human form had all but disappeared, replaced by a piece of walking geometry. This look was famously championed by Queen Elizabeth I of England, whose portraits show her as an icon of power, her body encased in these incredible, jewel-encrusted constructions. It was a projection of untouchable, almost divine authority. This taste for artificial shapes wasn't limited to women. Men of the same period wore a style of doublet called the peascod belly, which was heavily padded and stiffened to puff out in a low, pointed curve over the belt, mimicking the shape of a peacock's breast. The physical cost of this fashion was well documented. Contemporary medical texts and personal letters are full of complaints about the breathing difficulties, fainting spells, and indigestion caused by tight lacing. And the practicalities of navigating the world in a wheel farthingale, which could be several feet wide, were absurd. A noblewoman would have to turn sideways and carefully shuffle to get through a normal-sized doorway. Historians and sociologists still debate the meaning of this caged silhouette. Was it a reflection of a rigid, hierarchical society imposing order on the body? Or was it a powerful statement of aristocratic presence, a way for an elite woman to physically take up space and dominate a room? Whatever its meaning, this era took the idea of reshaping the body to its absolute zenith. The goal was to replace nature with a perfect man-made form, a living sculpture of wealth and power. For over a century, the elite European body had been a prisoner of fashion, encased in the rigid geometric cages of the corset and the farthingale. It was an era of engineered, artificial shapes, a style that took the human form and completely remade it. But fashion is a restless creature. An extreme style, pushed to its absolute limit, can only do one thing: collapse. And so, as the 17th century dawned, the pendulum began to swing back. The cage was unlocked, and after a long period of confinement, the body was allowed to return, albeit in a new, idealized form. The first thing to go was the absurdly wide wheel farthingale. It was replaced by a softer, more natural silhouette. The waistline of women's gowns rose, creeping up from its low, pointed position to sit high on the rib cage, just below the bust. Skirts were still voluminous, but their shape now came from layers of petticoats rather than a rigid hoop structure, allowing the fabric to fall and move with a new softness and fluidity. The focus shifted away from the underlying engineering and onto the sheer opulence of the fabric itself. This was the Baroque era, a time of dramatic, heavy silks, rich velvets, and intricate gold-threaded brocades. The neckline also changed, becoming lower and wider, often falling completely off the shoulders to create a broad, horizontal line that emphasized a woman's neck and bosom. While the corset, or stays, remained, its job was no longer to create a stiff, flat cone, but to support and lift the bust, creating the desired high-waisted, full-bosomed look. This trend towards a softer, more natural ideal accelerated dramatically in the 18th century, fueled by the philosophical currents of the Enlightenment. Thinkers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau celebrated the virtues of nature, reason, and a simpler, more authentic way of life. This new mood began to seep into fashion. The aristocracy, led by figures like Queen Marie Antoinette of France, began to play at a fantasy of rural simplicity. The heavy, formal silks of the court gave way to lighter fabrics, especially the printed cottons, or chintz, that were being imported from India. These fabrics were a sensation. They were colorful, comfortable, and, most revolutionary of all, easily washable. They became so popular that many European governments, in a bid to protect their own wool and silk industries, actually banned their importation, which of course only made the forbidden fabrics even more fashionable. This cult of beautiful simplicity reached its peak with a garment championed by Marie Antoinette herself, the chemise à la reine. It was, to put it simply, a white cotton dress. Made of layers of fine, semi-transparent muslin, it had a high waist tied with a sash and a soft, loosely gathered skirt. It was, in essence, an extremely expensive and fashionable version of a woman's own underwear. When the Queen's official portrait, showing her in this shockingly simple and informal dress, was exhibited in 1783, it caused a massive public scandal. The old guard was horrified that the Queen of France would appear in her underwear, abandoning the rigid formality that her rank demanded. They didn't see simplicity. They saw a dereliction of duty. But the style was revolutionary, and its influence spread rapidly through the new fashion magazines that were beginning to appear in Paris and London. Historians still debate the true meaning of this shift. Was it a genuine desire for a more natural life, or just a new, more subtle way for the super-rich to show off by wearing a simple white dress made of impossibly fine and expensive hand-woven cotton? Whatever the motive, the trend was clear. After a long affair with rigid construction, fashion had fallen in love with the ideal of the natural, setting the stage for a complete reset of the wardrobe. The Queen of France has been painted in her underwear, and the court is scandalized. But this is more than just a fashion faux pas. The simple white dress, the rejection of rigid formality, is a symbol of a world on the brink of a violent and total transformation. The intellectual currents of the Enlightenment that inspired a taste for simplicity were also fueling a much more dangerous idea, that the entire social order of kings, aristocrats, and peasants was unnatural and unjust. In 1789, that idea exploded. The French Revolution was a political earthquake that shattered the old world, and in its place, every single aspect of life, down to the clothes on your back, became intensely and dangerously political. During the Revolution, fashion was no longer about displaying wealth. It was about displaying your allegiance. To survive, you had to literally wear your politics on your sleeve. The first and most important piece of revolutionary dress was the tricolor cocked, a simple rosette of red, white, and blue ribbon pinned to your hat. It was the universal symbol of the new French Republic, and to be seen in the streets of Paris without one was to be marked as a potential traitor, a royalist sympathizer worthy of suspicion and violence. The most radical revolutionaries, the working-class militants of Paris, even got their name from their clothes. They were the sans-culottes, a name which literally means without knee breeches. They defiantly rejected the silk knee breeches, or culottes, which were the symbol of the idle aristocracy, and instead wore the long, practical trousers or pantalons of the laborer. They paired these with a short jacket and the bonnet rouge, a red conical cap based on the Phrygian cap given to freed slaves in ancient Rome, a potent symbol of their newfound liberty. During the most extreme phase of the revolution, the Reign of Terror, luxury itself became a crime. The elaborate silk gowns, the powdered wigs, the high-heeled shoes of the old regime vanished overnight. To dress like an aristocrat was to risk a very public and unpleasant appointment with the guillotine. After the terror subsided, the new French Republic embraced a style that cemented this rejection of the past. Known as the neoclassical or empire style, it took the simple, high-waisted muslin dress of Marie Antoinette's scandalous portrait and made it the official uniform of the new era. For several decades, women's fashion was defined by a column-like, draped silhouette, inspired by the art of Republican Rome and democratic Greece. The corset and the great structured skirts were, for a time, completely abandoned. But perhaps the most profound and lasting change happened to men's clothing. The revolution marks the moment that fashion historians call the Great Masculine Renunciation. In the span of a decade, the aristocratic male peacock, with his powdered wig, silk stockings, embroidered coat, and high-heeled shoes, became extinct. In his place emerged the modern man, dressed in a sober, dark, woolen suit. Color, lace, and extravagant decoration were now seen as frivolous and aristocratic. The new ideal was one of seriousness, professionalism, and subtle quality, expressed through the perfection of the tailoring rather than the opulence of the material. This is the direct ancestor of the modern business suit. As a quirky, hedonistic backlash, some young Parisians in the aftermath of the Terror, the so-called incroyables and merveilleuses, took fashion to bizarre extremes with ridiculously high collars and scandalously sheer dresses. But this was a brief fad. The larger trend was set. The French Revolution had created the great divide in modern clothing, a practical, stable, and sober uniform for men, and a constantly changing, decorative, and expressive sphere of fashion for women. The French Revolution was a bonfire that burned away the old world of aristocratic fashion. In its wake, you are left with a new, soberly dressed man and a woman clad in the simple, high-waisted classical column of the Empire style. For a brief, shining moment, the female body is free from the cages of the past. But the pendulum of fashion rarely rests for long. The simplicity of the revolutionary era was a reaction to an extreme, and it would, in turn, inspire its own extreme reaction. As the 19th century progresses, the memory of the revolution fades, and a new, powerful force begins to reshape the world. The Industrial Revolution. And this new age of iron and steam would forge a new kind of cage for the body, more powerful and more accessible than ever before. By the 1830s, the high waistline of the Empire dress began its slow descent back to its natural position. With its return came a renewed obsession with the tiny waist, and the corset, which had been lurking in the background, came back with a vengeance. But this was not the stay of the 16th century, made of whalebone and wood. This was an industrial product. New technologies like the invention of the metal eyelet allowed for laces to be pulled incredibly tight without ripping the fabric, and the stays themselves were now often reinforced with flexible strips of steel. The goal was to achieve the ultimate Victorian female ideal, the hourglass figure. The corset would violently cinch the waist to an impossibly small circumference, while simultaneously pushing the bust upwards and forcing the hips outwards. To further exaggerate this shape, the skirt began to expand once again. At first, this was achieved with sheer bulk. A woman might wear up to a dozen starched petticoats, which were incredibly heavy, hot, and cumbersome. But in the 1850s, a new piece of industrial technology offered a miraculous solution: the cage crinoline. It was the ghost of the old farthingale, but reborn in lightweight, mass-produced steel. A series of flexible steel hoops, suspended from the waist by fabric tapes, could create a vast, bell-shaped skirt of enormous proportions, with none of the weight of the old petticoats. It was the first fashion trend to be truly democratic. Thanks to factory production, cheap steel crinolines were available to almost everyone, from the wealthiest duchess to the factory girl, all of whom could now participate in the fashion for a gigantic skirt. This new industrial cage, however, was notoriously dangerous. The medical journals of the day were filled with dire warnings from doctors about the effects of tight lacing, deformed ribs, compressed internal organs, fainting spells, and damage to reproductive health. The crinoline, meanwhile, was a walking fire hazard. Its huge circumference and the flammable cotton fabrics of the era made it terrifyingly easy to accidentally brush against an open fireplace or a dropped candle. Thousands of women died in crinoline fires in the mid-19th century. They were also prone to getting caught in the spokes of carriage wheels or the gears of the new industrial machinery. The absurdity of the fashion was not lost on the public, and magazines were filled with satirical cartoons of women getting stuck in doorways or being blown away like umbrellas in a high wind. Social historians still debate the meaning of this extreme and restrictive silhouette. Was it a form of patriarchal control, turning the ideal middle-class woman into a fragile, immobile doll to signify her husband's wealth? Or did women themselves embrace it as a beautiful aesthetic, a way to claim their own space? What is clear is that industrial technology, which promised progress and freedom, had been used to place the female body into a beautiful, dangerous, and highly effective prison of steel and bone. You are trapped in the beautiful, dangerous, and industrially produced prison of the Victorian silhouette. The pendulum has swung to the peak of restriction, and for decades, the hourglass figure has reigned supreme. But every cage, no matter how strong, invites the dream of escape. And in the final years of the 19th century and the opening decades of the 20th, a series of powerful forces would converge to finally break the bars of the industrial cage, setting the body free and creating the modern wardrobe you know today. The first push came from within, from the reformers of the rational dress movement. These doctors, artists, and early feminists argued passionately that the corset was a medical menace and that the heavy, trailing skirts were unhygienic and impractical. They advocated for looser, lighter, and more sensible clothing. At the same time, a new force emerged: women in sport. For the first time, middle-class women were beginning to ride bicycles, play tennis, and swim. These activities were simply impossible in a tightly laced corset and a floor-length skirt. This practical need led to the creation of radical new garments, like the scandalous bloomers for cycling, which were a crucial early step in the return of trousers for women. But the final, decisive blow came from the cataclysm of the First World War. As millions of men left for the battlefields, women poured into the workforce to take their places. They worked in munitions factories, on farms, and as drivers and mechanics. In this new world of grease, machinery, and hard physical labor, the old fashions were not just impractical, they were lethal. Corsets were abandoned almost overnight because they restricted movement and breathing. Skirts became dramatically shorter to prevent them from getting caught in machinery. In a famous patriotic appeal, the US government asked women to stop buying corsets in 1917, claiming that the metal saved, some 28,000 tons of steel, was enough to build 2 new battleships. For the first time, fashion reform was an act of patriotism. The world that emerged from the war was utterly changed, and its new spirit was perfectly captured in the fashion of the Roaring Twenties. The silhouette of the flapper was the ultimate rejection of everything the Victorian era stood for. The dress was a short, straight, drop-waisted tube that completely ignored the body's natural curves. The hourglass was dead. The waist, for so long the focus of female fashion, disappeared entirely. Hemlines rose to the knee, a shocking and liberating change that had never been seen before in Western history. Women bobbed their hair, abandoning the elaborate updos of the past. This was the uniform of a new, modern woman. One who could work, vote, dance, and move freely through the world. This revolution was cemented by the rise of ready-to-wear clothing. The sewing machine and factory production meant that for the first time, fashionable, well-made clothes were available to almost everyone, not just the elite. Designers like the legendary Coco Chanel built empires on this new ideal of comfortable, practical elegance, borrowing from menswear and sportswear to create a look that was chic, modern, and liberating. "Luxury," she famously said, "must be comfortable, otherwise it is not luxury." And so, our long journey comes to its final chapter. You started as a naked, vulnerable primate on the African savanna. You created a second skin to survive the elements, a technology that allowed you to conquer the planet. You turned that skin into a canvas for your identity, a language of status and beauty. You engineered it into a cage to reshape your own body. And then, finally, you broke that cage. The story of what you wear is the story of who you are. A creature of breathtaking ingenuity, forever balancing the demands of practicality, the pressures of society, and the timeless human desire to tell the world your own story. And now, the long journey is over. The grand sweep of history, from the first crude hide draped over shivering shoulders to the complex choices hanging in your own closet, finally comes to rest. All the great forts, the grinding ice sheets, the rise and fall of empires, the whirring of the first factories, have gone quiet. The great parade of figures, the Ice Age hunter, the Roman senator, the medieval queen, all fade back into the soft darkness. All that remains is the simple, quiet truth of your own body, resting comfortably, a silent testament to that long, unbroken thread of survival and innovation. Let the echo of these distant lives gently recede, leaving only the soft hum of the fan, the gentle weight of your own blanket. There are no more worlds to conquer tonight, no more revolutions to fight. There is only this peaceful moment, an inheritance from all who came before, a silent space in which to finally, quietly rest. Sweet dreams.